Thank you, Debbie, and good to see everyone this afternoon. Thank you for joining us. And I'll also acknowledge that I too am joining you all from Ghana country and pay respects to elders past and present. Well, we're going to be talking about critical writing, the craft of writing and the importance of having a rigorous critical culture. I thought I would begin by asking you, Ali, for a little bit about a bit of background about how you came to arts and writing, your journey to finding yourself in the place that you are now as a respected senior lecturer. And if you could give us your perspective on why developing this capacity for independent critical voices, why it's so important to a culture of arts and creativity.
Oh, thank you, Jess. I just want to acknowledge, say hello to everyone and acknowledge that I'm on Ghana country, on the Ghana Plains, near Karawira-Parry, the River Torrens. And I'm actually living quite near to where I first studied at university, so the old Underdale campus of University of South Australia, which is now a new build housing development with very little evidence of the activities of the art school left. I guess to acknowledge also that I come from a long line of political people, educated people, artists, and activists, and throughout my education, including my schooling and my undergraduate degree, I wasn't taught by any Aboriginal people. And so the kind of impact, I wasn't taught in the formal sense. So inside those institutions of knowledge, the people that I was taught by growing up and that I understood to be my elders and community, our histories and knowledges, and even our histories in relation to colonisation were not known by the broader community, and certainly not really known by the other students at the art school. And some of the lecturers did know some parts of our histories, but we weren't taught them in a way that said Aboriginal people are front and centre in where we are located. And so for me, at various times that made me feel quite angry and potentially theoretically wounded. So I would go into spaces where it was just words and feel as though I'd been kind of cut apart by the violence of the deliberate absencing of our communities in this space. And what that ultimately meant for me was that I just kept going with my studies and my thinking, and I always loved making art. So I did walk away for a while and just didn't make any artwork. And then, you know, I returned to this space because it is a really, the visual arts in particular is a space where you can have lots of capacity for different voice. There's a freedom that can be found there, but there's also potentially a lot of superficiality. In terms of kind of why I think it's important to develop lots of different voices, but particularly Aboriginal people's perspectives on and read and listen to Aboriginal people's understandings of our histories, and Indigenous people's knowledges around our histories, of recent histories of colonialism and our long histories of country. I think otherwise we are really in threat of just having oppressive narratives overtake us, in ways that we can see historically are not beneficial to anyone, and they're not the kind of world that I want to live in with my children, or I want anyone's children to live in. So, and also the other creatures and human and non-human that we inhabit the planet with. Yeah.
What do you think? What was the like? What would you sort of credit was the thing that allowed you to make space and actually like and become such a, you know, because the journey is not linear, right? Like, so what was it for you that sort of got you into the space, and then how did you sort of make your way through it?
Okay. I think writing for me in particular is something that I had to try really hard to be good at. And after finishing my PhD, I pushed myself through such a difficult space, because that's what's required of you in an institution like a university to meet the requirements of a very of a whole set of kind of hoops that you need to jump through. But it required me to kind of be really good at writing, and that is something that has taken me a long time. But I guess it wasn't linear in any sense. Like the relationship to knowledge has always been fraught for me. And if I think about the kind of textual relationship to knowledge, in particular use of English, it's very anxiety provoking. If I think about my mum, and I think about my grandmother and all my aunties who I spent a lot of time with growing up, and spent time on the Nullarbor with my grandmother, I can kind of see that our relationship to the colonising kind of narrative has been oppressive. If you go and look at the kind of records that are kept on my family, the written accounts, and it's not just me, it's all Aboriginal people in South Australia. If you go to the South Australian State Records, or you go to any of these repositories, these archives, what you find is really violent textual evidence of the ideologies of colonialism that have justified movements and, you know, movements of people globally. But for me, I also have found I was always a reader, so I spend a lot of time reading Black women and Indigenous women, and it's been like a salvation for me reading some of my, you know, fellow beautiful women globally. Has saved my life at various times. So I understand the kind of responsibility. So it would never be that I would just absorb knowledge and not share. And even though sometimes it's very difficult for me to be brave and speak, I try to continue on a journey of honouring my elders and people who've come before me, the trailblazers, the political people, the activists who have gone, who remind me that I have something to share and that I should share it. So yeah, so I come back and forth into that feeling of and Natalie Harkin, who's part of the Unbound Collective, might say we're compelled to respond. And certainly I feel a compulsion to respond, but also a compulsion to hold space for my communities. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the reading is such a huge part of writing, like not only from like understanding theoretical frameworks and the work that other people have already done and the foundations of theory that we're building on, but also as a way to develop craft is such a part of it. And I think that's a really good point about being generous and trying to think of the expression that I heard someone use yesterday about not pulling up the rope behind you, leaving the rope so that others can come up with you as you move through your, practice or career or what have you. Thank you, Ali. I suppose with thinking about some of those things, like particularly when you're talking about like legacies of the ongoing colonization, of being in a place that has never actually experienced a moment of decolonization, thinking about institutions, and so Raylene, I was going to ask you, thinking about the fact that so many of us inhabit multiple roles within our creative lives. And so we may work sometimes with institutions, we may work independently, we may work with collectives, and often there are power dynamics and tensions between those things that we have to constantly navigate. So I was wondering how you navigate the power dynamics between these different kinds of entities, institutions, being an artist, and working in grassroots spaces. And how do you maintain integrity and agency as a critic? And what kind of tensions or responsibilities do critics have to themselves and to the art and to the community?
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. That's very loaded sort of question. And I like the point that you mentioned before about our practice not being linear, and the fact that most times I don't consider myself a critic. I consider myself an arts worker that does a lot of writing, and writing is forming a sort of major component of that at the moment. But you're right, as a writer or as a critic or as an artist, we have to navigate a lot of different relationships with different forms of power structures and institutions. And Adelaide being a smaller community, they're places that you could either have been formally employed by and then become a reviewer of a particular exhibition in their space. There's all kinds of different changes in the way that we work with other spaces and artists. But I think for myself, and I think for the pieces of writing that I've done as an independent writer, I try to stay informed by both the facts. I think that some of the best forms of writing or reviews and critical reviews that I've read are kind of based both in the facts of either the space and what they are showing and how they've positioned that work, and then the sense of expression. I think critical reviews, writing reviews, it's an art form in itself, and it's a form of expression in itself. And I think that we have to kind of value that writer is trying to create a kind of work that can stand on its own feet as well. There are a lot of things over the years I've kind of learned, and on like a very sort of base sort of level in administrative sort of way, is that I think you have to sort of balance the opportunity with what are you being paid, what's the information that you've received about this exhibition that you're reviewing, all of those things. I have to keep going back to the NAVA code of practice at times, like, am I being paid the appropriate wage for this piece of writing? There are uncomfortable conversations to have, but I think that they're necessary, that we're all sort of on the same kind of level playing field. And I think for us in Adelaide, we have a small collection of major institutions, and I think it's necessary that we kind of critique them, and not so much in those sort of binaries of being either positive or negative. I think if ever there's a time that we're living in a grey space, it's right now with this pandemic. But I believe that we have to have these uncomfortable conversations, and we need to publish work that really not criticizes, but deeply engages across a lot of different forms of reading, and engages with the different forms of knowledge, that really questions what these institutions are doing. What are they providing for us? Just sort of researching this question, I was reminded of a piece that Fine Print published by artist James Tyler about decolonising Indigenous Australian art at the Art Gallery of South Australia, and the fact that the lack of prominent exhibition spaces, the use of temporary exhibition spaces, or kind of thoroughfares throughout the gallery. And the piece is remarkable in its sense that it uses strong research of what the collection has, what it has produced, statistical information of what they've exhibited, but then also his own personal realizations of like the lack of representation, how he can position himself within that space, and what he can and can't see through the exhibitions that AGSA have produced. I think it's a really, really striking work that sort of begs the right questions. And I think that, yeah, there needs to be more writing like it, that not just, it doesn't just criticize, but it just sort of deeply asks the purpose, you know. I think it's really, it's, yeah, based in like, what is the purpose? What are the objectives of these larger sort of spaces? I also was reminded of a piece last year that a Chinese Australian artist, Lily Lay, wrote about working at the MCA. And I think it was more like a blog post than an article, but she speaks of many encounters of racism, of classism, of a lot of ingrained problems within the internal framework of the organisation, not so much of its exhibitions, but it really explores the other side, the other behind the gallery walls of what happens. And, you know, these are important questions to ask too, because really it's everything that's happening at the top has an immense effect of what ends up on their walls and how they present themselves to a community. So I think there is some impeccable writing out there that really does sort of question what institutions can do, and it does it in a respectful way that yeah, it sort of balances that line between here are some strong facts and research, and here is my position and my opinion.
Yeah, fantastic. I think that idea of questioning and the engagement, like the invitation that is inherent within the question, is such a good point, Ray. Yeah. Before we talk about the kind of nuts and bolts of craft and criticism, I thought I would ask you, Lauren, about what Ray mentioned, the money. So I thought I'd mention the fact that obviously we're living in a time where you know, work is increasingly precarious and casualized, and I mean that has often been the case for writers and critics, but even more so now with, I guess, even the changing media and arts landscape. Just wanted to just think about your thoughts on sustaining or developing a sustainable practice. Like, is it possible to do that, or what are some suggestions for people wanting to engage more in critical writing, how to do so in a way that is somewhat sustainable, perhaps?
I think having an independent writing practice is not really an individual pursuit. It's not really a career pursuit in the way I think about it. A lot of people ask me advice on how to be a writer today, and what I usually tell them is that there's a subtext to that question, and it's where do you stand in society? What resources do you have available to you? What's your standing, and who do you know in the art and media sectors? Because As you say, like what's happening in the world isn't just happening out there. Arts institutions have adopted casual work practices, freelancing, contracting. You know, what that means is that people who can subsidize their way into a sustainable practice are the ones who make it, unless you can bear the poverty, the discrimination, unless you can find other ways to bring in money that aren't in the sector. I became a lot happier when I did that as well, because it meant that I was off the treadmill of the marketing cycle of what's on. You know, like you get a lot of emails coming in from publicists, and I was like, I don't want to do that. You know, I don't want to be telling people what's on the weekend, what art shows to go to. I want to be developing new ideas and making an original contribution to knowledge. And so the way to do that for me, to have an independent writing practice, is to write really long essays that feed in ideas from academia and make those ideas available to a broader audience. You know, and I think that's a different way of thinking about it than what are my career prospects? You know, like it's more like, what can I do to advance the culture so that we are not imbibing hostile ideologies. We're not imbibing ideas of a fairyland in, you know, as late capitalism advances, as it stagnates rather. I think what I'm seeing from my vantage point is that the institutions are somewhat weak. They're not just underfunded, they're under attack. And in Australia, the long-term effect of living in a settler colonial society that has refused to grapple with that reality is that there's very few viewpoints on display. There's a high level of intellectual conformity. So if we're going to talk about having an independent writing practice, we need to talk about how to open up perspectives beyond whatever the dominant liberal viewpoint that, you know, we've just absorbed by osmosis is. That requires finding new ways to make work together. It's not just about how you as a freelancer can like bargain a better fee from an outlet or from an institution. It's about saying, how are we going to ask for full employment again? Are we going to ask arts institutions not just to put us on contracts, but for permanency? Are we going to ask, collectivize? Are we going to find new ways to honour the independent part of the sector so that we are properly funding artists' collectives? And how are we thinking about diversity? Is it just a matter of changing the gatekeepers, or is it also a matter of changing the values, opening up the kind of viewpoints, political, cultural perspectives that are available and discussed? And is it really working toward a place where we know that independent, critical, robust arts writing leads to more rigorous practice? The two are connected, right? So we need to support each other collectively, collaboratively, find ways to do that outside the decaying institutions.
Yeah, absolutely. So with that in mind, then so Ali, if we can come back to you, how do you develop that independent voice, and how do you develop your own style and your own critical frameworks to do all of those things that we've just spoken about, that both you and Ray and Lauren have mentioned? So from a sort of like from the craft level, like, and we spoke about reading before, but what else? So what else can we do to develop these skills?
I want to acknowledge some of the issues that have been raised by Raylene and Lauren in relation to the relationship between institutions and what it means to work within an institution at this point. And for me as an Aboriginal person, what it means to work within a university. that's named after a non-Indigenous coloniser and that has a tall ship for its logo, and consistently is unable to employ, like it has a reconciliation action plan, but it's unable to really find enough Aboriginal academics to be representative of our communities in any of the discipline areas across the university. And I think about the relationship between that institution, which trains gatekeepers for other institutions. So we train social workers, we train epidemiologists, we train doctors, nurses, we train artists. And I'm interested in the relationship between institutions. I don't, you know, that grey area that Raylene's talking about and the role of art. For me, it's a much larger issue around our cultural narratives, our ability to be able to see ourselves, our ability to be able to tell our stories, requires us to not let people just continue, like in our communities, the institutions that I find like I just want to run screaming from the room around child protection and incarceration. I have to teach about those statistics, and that fuels my art practice. If I didn't have meaningful things, if I didn't have something to say about the complete absence of or inability of institutions to continually perpetuate their own power dynamics, and the fact that globally we've just, it's astounding how complexly tied up we are, and that idea of an independent voice or being hamstrung, being paid a wage, and in a sense the inability to speak truth in that space, what does that mean? And, you know, I like what you were saying, Raylene, about what James has talked about in relation to the Art Gallery of South Australia. And I think about the Aboriginal people who are employed in that space. But it's not just about having independent voice. There needs to be this kind of, people need to be able to have a creative response to the challenges that we're collectively facing, or we're all just, it's so dire otherwise, for, well, particularly for me. I can't, and I think about like disciplines like psychology at my university, which I just haven't managed to graduate an Aboriginal person in a PhD. And I think about the role of individualism and psychology and the suicide rates in my communities. And I think about how I have so many problems with the kind of inability of that collaboration, of that, yeah, I don't know what I'm pretty, you know, sad that yeah, I did a topic 2 weeks ago. I taught an intensive called Decolonising Institutions, and I asked students to consider political, cultural, geographical landscapes, particularly the CBD of Adelaide, and really consider where Aboriginal people are, where are Kaurna people represented in our physical space, in our political space, in our, where are Aboriginal people, where are our histories shown, visible, and, you know, and then critique the way, the relationships to power, and how we continue to be, after all of this time, after all that we know, unable to really break that apart in any real way. So I just see it as, you know, silence is a killer for our communities. We need to be speaking up, and lots of people do. Yeah. Sorry, I've gone off onto a rant, but I guess those things connect, you know, in terms of independent voice. And for me, it's kind of just knowing the facts, the histories, and sometimes the complete silences is what, the silences that are so almost deafening around us, that you know, seem so obvious about our collectivity and our capacity for love and our humanness, you know. Yeah.
I just wondered if Lauren or Ray wanted to add anything or reflect on anything that Ali mentioned. I think we had, oh, go.
I just, thank you so much, Ali, for what you share. I recognize, yeah, it's really tricky because, you know, it's like that article that you shared with me earlier, Jessica, had this sort of series of very short sentences that, like, writing is a privilege, reading is a privilege, being written about is an extreme privilege. And, you know, it does make me wonder, because there's a lot of writing out there, and with the internet and with online platforms, there's an excessive amount of writing being produced. But yeah, Ali, I think what you really highlight is that there's this massive divide between that writing really impacting these spaces that hold and wield so much sort of power in what is displayed and shown. It reminded me, Corinna Lester in the catalogue for the Image Is Not Nothing Concrete Archives that's just opened at ACE Open. Her essay is just phenomenal, and it kind of relays all of the advocacy work that she's done around nuclear testing on her homeland. And as incredible as the piece was, I did have this like deep kind of sadness that for her people, her family, it's all been about, all of their advocacy and work has been about conforming into these ways of working that are outside what they're generally accustomed to. And yeah, it feels as though a lot of academia, and I mean, even sometimes with some experimental writing, it still sort of conforms to this particular kind of format that's somewhat digestible, or that, you know, it sort of, yeah, it will work in a particular way for a particular audience. And yeah, I could just imagine that that's just, Corinna's essay is beautiful, but it just sort of sounds so tiring as well, to just be constantly readapting and changing strategy and changing foot, all to align with policy and law abiding and all of that sort of thing. Yeah, that just sprung to my mind then.
I agree with that.
Well, I might ask Lauren, in terms of like form, like something that's really interesting is like the way that form, like the formal qualities of criticism can become reproduced or replicated, and they do different things. So maybe like as a starting point, like what's the difference between like a review and criticism, and then like, you know, and maybe just some reflections on that and what good critical writing does.
I guess I think of a review as being part of that marketing cycle. You know, this is not something that's easy for a lot of writers to admit, that they're part of the publicity machine in a way, and that there's an aspect of criticism that overlaps with marketing, as well as overlapping with, you know, literature being creative expression in and of itself. You know, so that's kind of part of why I stepped away from arts journalism. I think it is, you know, form is connected to ideas and politics. And I think like in Australia, we are going to have to find new forms to communicate, because see, in media, in journalism, there's just less space for reviews and criticism, right? And all of it is tied to what's getting a theatrical release, or, you know, editors are taking their leads from the major institutions. What's a blockbuster show that's going to have national significance because frankly, you know, there's so few publications left. There's been a shrinkage of the media landscape, and the rest of the media landscape is so corporatized. We have the most monopolized media, you know, in the world. And I think, Ali, the silences that you're talking about are related to this limited expression that we have for who to write for critically, who will let us write in an extremely active, engaged way, because frankly, journalism has gotten really boring. You know, it's trafficking in the same forms, the same tired, formulaic formats and genres. You know, they just want you to crank out entertainment journalism, which sucks for the reader, sucks for us if we want to develop a bit of autonomy. And it means we're never going to get any new ideas out there and show what the relationship between writing and art is. So yeah, that's why I have gravitated to the essay and to kind of experimental formats that like draw a bit of a whirlpool, draw the reader into a bit of a vortex, because frankly, like, we need to be like real about this. Most art doesn't challenge power. It just doesn't. It's in a kind of walled off world of culture. But I think if we're gonna have the independent art writing community that we crave, we're gonna have to challenge this lack of accessibility, lack of availability, this formal restriction that is put on to us. Like, really, who would you write for? Like, there's the Saturday paper, for example, among the big, there's just not that many independent options. So experimenting with form, that is the devices we're using, is really important. And to develop that in myself, I don't read Australian press. Like, I just don't. I read, you know, N+1, which is probably the most radical politically in terms of the Anglophone literary magazines. Harper's, which has long form essays that think through the Americas, like not just North America, but North and South America, and London Review of Books, because they have ideological diversity, and they think you learn stuff. Like, I think that there's a lot of politically undereducated journalists in Australia, because you can go through a journalism degree without really studying history or politics or geography. You'd be more likely to study a stream on social media. It's like, do you think most journalists know that the nation state was only invented in 1648? I don't think they do. So we've got to really take this on to ourselves, like, to actually understand the hostile ideologies that this world has put on us and said, we have to accept it. We don't have to accept it, but that means creating an independent art sector for each other.
Yeah, fantastic. We can take questions if anyone listening in would like to either write it in the chat or just signal in some way. I thought while Lauren just mentioned a few great publications, Ali and Ray, do you want to maybe recommend like any publications that you particularly love, or any particular writers who are doing really cool stuff right now?
I've been reading a lot of Black theory from the US, like Fred Moten and Denise Ferreira da Silva, and eFlux is a online, you know, it's kind of arts and really dense theory, but particularly Denise Ferreira da Silva's kind of discussion around kind of racialized grammar and a kind of the ethical judicial kind of crisis that we face globally. So I was particularly, I've been, you know, I read a lot of Aboriginal writers. I'll just read widely. I kind of like some pulp as well sometimes, and I like to read a lot of Aboriginal short stories, and I'm constantly trying to seek out, I guess, independent, you know, presses. Like, so Nat's published with Vagabond, and, you know, there's just a few, you know, little artists kind of books are really interesting to me as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I'm the same as Ali. It's quite diverse. I think I'm always sort of checking like other art journals similar to Fine Print, like Runway, that do some incredible experimental, sort of curated to a degree. They've got some beautiful issues, and 4A Art Space in Sydney have 4A papers, which are always yeah, great resources, and they involve a lot of artists writing, not just writers writing, that is always intriguing and always just takes the writing to a different sort of dimension, a different kind of place, which I always yeah, I really sort of enjoy. I think reflections from artists is something that, yeah, I really sort of, I seem to be consumed by and can read quite quickly. Sort of that insight direct from an artist is really sort of appealing to me.
Yeah, fantastic. And Ali, you mentioned Natalie Harkin before, who I'm sure we're all familiar with. I think in terms of like experimentation with form, you know, using the work that she does with Vagabond is, yeah, using like maybe what would be in some ways a traditional book of poetry, to use that as an artwork, like an art object as itself, that also weaves archival, like literally weaves archival texts with poetic responses. Like there's, yeah, so many brilliant people who are doing amazing experimental formal work like that. Just checking, Debbie, would you like us to break out into our breakout rooms?
I think that's a wonderful idea. Thank you so much to everyone for such an incredibly rich and inspiring conversation, and for so much vulnerability as well. Thank you very, very much. So for the audience, we're now going to go into breakout rooms. So both Jessica and I have a couple of questions, and we might just throw one out there, and then our excellent tech will throw us into breakout rooms to discuss a little more personally our own situation or beliefs around writing and community, and where, you know, we see that going forward. Do you want to kick off with a question, Jess?
Well, I suppose I was just going to talk about the development of style. And so just like actually like a really like nuts and bolts question about like, obviously, like if you have, if you know what you want to do, so if you know that what you want to do is like maybe interrogator work or question it's like, you know, it's provenance or like whatever it is, like how do you actually figure out how to achieve the thing that you want to achieve? So talking about some of those kinds of, yeah, crafty things.
Wonderful, thank you. We're going to ask Polly to pop us into some breakouts, and I just remind everyone that you're alone in that room together, so feel free to have the conversation that you want to have, and we don't have to report that conversation back to us like a classroom. It's just in that moment and time. So thank you, and thanks Polly for administering the breakout. Do you have another question that you'd like to ask, Jess, or would you like me to put one out there?
No, not really. I mean, I guess the thing that we were just talking about in our breakout room was about the fact that maybe sometimes people can be hesitant to be too critical in what they say. Like maybe there isn't like a culture of people feeling able to respond in a vigorous way that is in the kind of way that we need, that is that's necessary, yeah, to have that culture. So I just thought I'd mention that that's what we were talking about.
Lauren, do you mind if I out you for a moment? Because you made a really great I guess proposition within our little chat about remodeling how we contribute and how we write in our industry. Do you mind repeating that for this? I think you're still on mute, actually.
Yeah, no, I think it is actually related to what Jessica was saying about challenging this culture of intellectual timidity. I think we're all waiting around for a new form, a new model, a new way for others to do critical arts writing, to find a new approach. But I think there's got to be some kind of buy-in across the arts sector from everyone who has a stake in that, and that's everyone, to contribute to a new, I don't know what it would be, you know, a publication, for example, to say, yeah, this, you know, critical arts writing is as important as the art itself, and we can't wait around for a philanthropist or a property developer like Maury Schwartz. You know, if you really want a kind of alternative to the Murdoch press, the art sector, us ourselves, are going to have to collaborate and put in money to pay writers and editors to produce really, really great, excellent stuff, so we can develop that part of the sector. So that's galleries, that's the big institutions, it's everyone. Everyone needs to partake in this project.
Thanks, Lauren. I think that's a great observation or great way forward. I have one question that I wouldn't mind everybody asking. We can either do it in a breakout, or we have a relatively small group, I think. But I'm really interested in what people are reading and who they turn to. I guess our speakers spoke about that a little bit. But I guess also that we're hearing from particularly passionate people that are doing this for a living, and I'm interested to know what the rest of us are reading, and whether it is as critical or whether it's kind of more fun reading. Does anyone want to reveal what they're reading and how it might inform their practice? Or is it too intimidating in a larger group to answer that? Not particularly.
I wouldn't mind. Hi.
Go on, Susan. You're wonderful. Come on.
Well, I hope it's all right to mention this, but it feels very strange to sort of land here, knowing what's just sort of gone on around us in the Australian political space, you know, just an hour before. And I feel like actually probably social media is what I read. And that's where I get all my leads. I don't mean exploiting other people's knowledge. I mean, that's where the energy line is. And that's where, that's what I'm curating at the moment. And so I have all these amazing voices that are local, they're Aboriginal, they're international. And then that's where I then follow a thread. And usually I might be following the thread of the speaker, something that they've written, something that they've produced. And I think the other thing that I'd say is this COVID, certainly for me, I mean, I know the popular narrative about it is it has made us look at our lives, and I think that's true. If you have the position to be able to look at your life and detach from it and look at it. And I felt there was the moment where I could have like just walked away from the arts, like, and I kind of did that for like half a day. And then I return and I'm all in. And that kind of, I think, aligns with what Lauren is saying a bit, like, and Ali as well, and her community. I'm all in. And yeah, having a voice and finding a way for those words to go together with that voice. So that's what I'd say.
Can I ask you a question, Susan, which is a little bit off this particular panel, but I know that you've just been part of a wonderful project through Guildhouse, which was writer in residence at the City Library with the City of Adelaide. And you had the opportunity to read your works to an audience, and it was new work, and it was work that you'd been developing through the residency, but also quite separate to that residency as well, I think, returning to Adelaide and synthesising quite a lot of information and feelings. And I wonder how that felt for you, actually presenting that to an audience and getting outside of the studio, because I guess a lot of writers don't see the response to their words. They kind of write them and they're setting their baby free. But I wonder how you felt actually having the opportunity to perform them in front of an audience, and if that changed the words in any way or your feelings.
Oh, look, I really appreciate it, and I thank Guildhouse again and City of Adelaide for that opportunity. And that's what I like about Guildhouse. As I said on the day, you know, they have supported 2 artists in residence, an emerging curator, and myself, as well as all these other projects. And you know, our residency sort of started. My residency started 2 weeks after Adelaide came out of lockdown. And they went ahead with those residencies. One of the questions became in the application, could you do this at home if you had to? And they never once used the words resilience or adapt, even though, as I say, I know I'm really resilient and I did adapt. But, you know, that gets used as a way like, leave this arts business and go and do something proper. But that's not what Guildhouse did, so I appreciate that. And look, I loved doing that reading, and I loved the responses that I got from people. But what I found that I did was I had already put in an application to Arts South Australia to keep writing. And from that reading, I found myself applying for an Australia Council grant and not enjoying that process one little bit. And I thought, oh my God, I've got into that trap again of spending all my time writing about writing instead of writing. And I just have to have some sense of, I don't know, I don't know what the right word to use in this particular context is, but a belief that something's going to happen from that writing, and that it doesn't have to be an Australia Council grant that will force me to go in a particular direction that actually I don't really want to do. And I'd rather just stay home and write, or go elsewhere and write. So, and I have a habitual thing of wanting to curate all the time. And actually it's much better if I put all that energy and ideas into the writing. And so that's what I'm doing. Thank you for asking.
Thank you, Susan. It's lovely to hear your dulcet tones once more. Do we have any closing remarks from any of the speakers or from Jessica? We might begin to wrap up, I think.
Oh, well, I would throw it over to Ali, Ray and Lauren if there's anything else to add. I think that's just a good point though, Susan, about, as Lauren was saying about not waiting around for a philanthropist, also not waiting around for government funding to change. Obviously there's a lot of important advocacy work that we will all do, but you can't wait around for a grant. I suppose that there have to be other ways of getting your work out there and your voice out there.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Thank you to Jessica and Ali and Raylene and to Lauren. It's really fantastic to hear this conversation, and I feel like it's really the tip of the iceberg, and I feel like we'll all think of some more questions and continue this conversation ahead for a long time to come. So thank you so much.